I know you've all read in the newspaper, on Facebook, or in your program book about tonight's speaker. So I'm going to make a very brief introduction and just say that Officer Stewart is a deer, elk, and moose management specialist with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, and is going to share the state's position on urban deer problems and other deer questions. Take it away, Chad.
All right. Well, thank you, Carla. I really appreciate the introduction. Thank you and Doug for the invitation, for Shauna for helping assist things. As Carla mentioned, my name is Chad Stewart. I'm based out of the Lansing area. I really was hoping to be there with everybody tonight, but unfortunately, some circumstances just are still like this, and this is the next best thing. And like I said, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. I've been working with the department now for about 7 years. Before that, I worked in Indiana as their deer biologist. And before that, I was actually working with the Smithsonian Institute as a researcher in Virginia, working on, as you probably would guess, at deer projects, as well as some international projects as well in China and Malaysia. So I've been doing a lot of deer research and deer management now for well over 20 years. And one of the things that keeps coming up in my line of work is this conflict with deer, and especially as they get into suburban and exurban communities, and how to manage those deer. So I've got a presentation prepared for everybody tonight that I will hopefully share correctly. And Shauna, if you could just sort of give me, I got a thumbs up, so I'm doing something right. That's good, start. And I'm really, with this talk, trying to take more of a community-based approach. Of course, there are certain things each and every one can do from their own personal property or garden standpoint, but it can be limited. Really, a lot of the source of the problem sometimes lies at the community. And the issue with deer is that it's usually not a community-wide problem. It's usually part of an area that is problematic with deer, whereas other parts of the community might have very few or sometimes even no deer. So that can certainly create a challenge from a management standpoint. From a personal property or personal garden perspective, I'll just start off and say that really exclusion and preventing deer from getting access to that is really your best option in terms of keeping your plants alive and not eaten. Of course, the problem with that is that some of those exclusion measures can become very unsightly and sort of defeat the purpose of some of the work that you're trying to accomplish by having such a beautiful garden or a healthy, vegetable garden as well. So that certainly creates problems and certainly doesn't necessarily solve a lot of the issues. I'll talk about some repellents and whatnot that can be done, as well as sort of alternative plantings that some folks may have had success with and others may not have. A lot depends on really the deer in your community and the amount of available food that's with it. But, to start sort of at a much larger level, I want to just basically start off by saying that, so maybe you have a deer problem in Marshall, and I can promise you that you are not the only community that would be dealing with a deer issue. We have multiple communities that reach out to the DNR every year. Some we continually work with that have frustrations with deer in their neighborhoods, in their communities. And as you can see, it's not necessarily limited to just whitetail deer, which is the deer species we have here in Michigan. There are communities that have issues with elk in the western part of North America. Certainly you see the moose there. That's not really how you want to get close and personal with a moose. And then certainly even international areas have urban deer as well. And it's mainly because deer are very, very accepting of these sort of habitats or landscapes that suburban communities provide. And that's very much true for many deer species around the world. Obviously, with whitetail deer being the species in Michigan, they are extremely prolific, and I'll talk about that, and that can lead to some of the frustrations. But as we talk about why communities engage in deer management, it can really be for a host of different reasons. Sometimes people get threatened by the tameness of deer, and even though it's extremely rare for a deer to show any type of aggression towards a person, there are documented cases every year of aggression towards pet dogs, especially during the breeding season. And it has happened where deer have been aggressive towards human. It's, like I said, it's very rare, but it certainly makes people feel very uncomfortable when you have a large 120 to 160 pound animal that just doesn't seem to want to move away from you. And that can be very daunting. Another one, obviously, is some of the landscape damage that you see. And certainly if anybody's ever tried to grow a hosta in an area with a lot of deer, you are probably very frustrated and land on one end of the spectrum in terms of what your thoughts are about deer. Sort of the native regeneration in your community's forest is always a concern. There in that middle picture, you see a really small buck with a leaf in its mouth, and what do you see growing in that understory is not a whole lot. There's virtually no vegetation in that forest, and obviously from a long-term perspective, you see potential for just not as much regeneration and having a healthy forest long-term. So certainly that's something that taking action now and trying to prevent it from getting to that stage is really helpful. The bottom center there is actually from a picture that I took when I was living in Bloomington, Indiana. They had a community-based garden, and obviously deer were quite a threat to there. So there's a lot of emphasis on making sure the gates are closed, and that obviously you can see that's attached to a wire mesh fence there to try to keep animals out of that neighborhood garden. And then obviously raiding bird feeders, roadkills is a very big issue that is often brought up, and just having deer sort of all over your community, your yard. Obviously the pellets that deer are dropping can be quite a nuisance as well in some of these communities. Another thing that's often brought up is Lyme disease, and Lyme disease is one of those things that is starting to slowly expand geographically. Lyme actually is from the community in Connecticut where it was first identified, and has spread throughout much of the mid-Atlantic and certainly into the Midwest at this point. And obviously with the changing climate that we're starting to experience and the expansion of some of these reservoir insect populations, we're starting to see the expansion of some of the diseases that might be associated with some of these animals as well. The relationship between Lyme disease and deer is a little bit tricky still. So one researcher in 2012 found that Lyme disease was actually more related to the lack of small mammal predators that are in a community. So if you think about the life cycle of a tick and how it picks up the spirochete that is Lyme disease from the white-footed mouse, the field mouse that you have, and sort of works its way through deer to the adult stage. Deer are not contracting Lyme disease. They're just simply a part of the cycle of ticks and harboring Lyme disease. But if you have a lot fewer foxes and coyotes, the things that are preying on those small mammals, you're going to have a lot more of those white-footed mice, those parameciscus mice that are out there in the environment, which essentially means you have more habitat for ticks who are contracting that spirochete from those mice originally, and you're going to have a higher incidence of Lyme disease potentially in your community. Compare that with what was found again in Connecticut in 2014, and they found that if you can actually get some sort of lethal management incorporated with your deer population and drive that deer density down, the number of human cases that were being experienced with Lyme disease was started to be reduced. So again, it's sort of a unique relationship that is still being understood in terms of deer densities, as well as small-footed mice densities and predators, and obviously the ticks as well. So some of the things I wanted to point out about urban deer and some of the biology behind it is they're fascinating individuals to study, and that's true for all white-tailed deer, but especially in these urban settings, because what you see is that you have very high levels of reproduction, and deer are notorious for reproducing anyway. But what you see in urban or suburban settings is that there's a lot more vegetation available to them to consume, which means that they have a lot healthier bodies going into the breeding season, coming out of the winter, and they're able to support increased fawn production because of that. So we call that density dependence, basically meaning that if a deer's physical condition starts to decline, their reproductive capacity will decline as well. But if they have living in a very nutritious, high quality forage area, they're able to support increased reproduction. So from an urban standpoint, I've seen reports as high as 1.8 fawns per adult doe. Now, typically that's a recruitment. So what I mean by that is the fawns that are being recruited into adulthood. Now, most adult does will have 2 fawns, but you tend to see a little bit lower survival in many instances in a rural community where those animals aren't quite achieving adulthood. In an urban setting, with the lack of or absence of predators, you tend to see high recruitment, which means a high and faster growth rate. Another thing that's really interesting is that there is no reproductive senescence in female white-tailed deer. So there's no such thing as menopause in female white-tailed deer. So they can start breeding as early within their first year. So the fawns that you see in your community in May and June that are those nice little balls of cuteness that are all covered in dots, if they can get to about 80 to 90 pounds by December or maybe January, they can actually be bred and because reproduction is timed in white-tailed deer, so they're always having fawns at the same time every year. What you're seeing is on their first birthday, they're giving birth to a fawn themselves. And that can happen in 20 to 40% of fawns, especially in these very robust agricultural areas that we see, and certainly suburban as well. But even if a fawn is long-lived, or I'm sorry, a doe is long-lived, they'll continue to have 2 to 3 fawns every year for the duration of their life, every single year. So if you get an old 10 to 12 to 14-year-old doe, it's possible that they could have close to 30 fawns or be responsible for 30 fawns alone throughout the course of their life into a community. You also see high survival rates in urban settings. Again, you don't have a lot of mortality factors associated with deer in urban settings outside of getting hit by a car in most cases. I've seen reports as high as 87%. So typically you can see how populations grow. They're long-lived, they survive, and they reproduce at very high rates. So it's very easy to see how deer populations can grow pretty quickly. And then home range size is a lot smaller in urban white-tailed deer than in rural settings. And that's because the things that are important and needed for a white-tailed deer to survive, which is safety, shelter, food, and water, they can get that and meet those needs in a much smaller area than what they do in a rural setting where they have to wander a little bit further. So what that tends to do is exacerbate some of the problems that people experience because they're occupying that space with a lot more frequency than their rural counterparts. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the George Reserve in Michigan. It's actually owned by the University of Michigan at this point. It's in southeastern Michigan. It's a 2 square mile fence facility. And the relevance is that some of the early work on deer population dynamics was first done right here in Michigan, which is really fascinating and interesting. So in 1928, 6 deer were put into that pen just to see how they would grow. And by 1934, so just in 6 years, there were 180 deer. And in 1935, 1 more year later, there were 222. So in a matter of about 7 years, they went from 6 deer to 222. What's fascinating about the George Reserve is that research project was done again in 1975. And in 1975, 10 deer were introduced, and 6 years later, 212 deer were counted in that pen. So it's the same population growth rate over 50 years apart. So it just shows a testament to the quality of the research that was done in both cases, because the results were replicated. But two, how fast deer populations can grow in a sort of a safe, controlled environment. From a state's management standpoint, we've done quite a bit of changes in recent years, and there's almost been what I would call a paradigm shift in how we are managing for white-tailed deer. So, less than 100 years ago, we were moving deer around because parts of the state were completely devoid of deer. There was a lot of over-harvest of deer preceding 1900 because it was completely unregulated. We started having some of our traditionally managed seasons occurring in the 1950s and building up from there. But all the way through the 1990s, we've been really trying to build our white-tailed deer herd. And it wasn't that hard to do because of some of the factors I told you previously. Now we're almost in a pattern of we need to try to control that growth, and in some cases, reduce deer in many areas as we're starting to experience these conflicts that are associated with overabundant white-tailed deer populations. And one of the changes that's really making that more difficult to encounter are these changes on the landscape that we're seeing. So this is an aerial map of an area just outside of Indianapolis in 1999. Obviously, not that long ago for everybody, right? But if you look at that same area just 9 years later, and this is in 2008, what you see is a very different complexion on the landscape. So going back to 1999, what you had was a largely agricultural area. There was probably a lot more hunters at that point and a lot more opportunity for hunting in some of those areas, which is how we traditionally manage our state's white-tailed deer herd. But then you go and have a development built like this. There might be a golf course in there. And from a deer's perspective, this is the best thing that can happen, because what you've done is you've created not only maintained a lot of food and forage, but in some ways you've offered a lot of protection to them as well, because you can't really hunt very efficiently, or in some cases, maybe even safely in an area or a situation like that. There are opportunities to remove deer lethally and safely, which I'll talk about, but it becomes a lot more challenging and certainly a lot less efficient, especially to keep up with some of the growth rate that deer can experience. So, again, from a deer standpoint, what a great change to experience. One of the challenges we see with white-tailed deer management are these concepts of carrying capacity. And there are really two different types of carrying capacity. There's a biological carrying capacity, which loosely defined means how many deer can the habitat support. And that is very difficult to define, but very easy to see once you meet or exceed it, because you start seeing deer that become very skinny, in very poor condition. You are actually start deer maybe even starving. And then you've got social carrying capacity. The difference with that is how many deer, it's not how many deer an area can support, but how many deer can an area tolerate. And that, again, is very difficult to measure because there's a lot of variability in a community's opinion in what they can tolerate. I will tell you this, that typically, especially in southern Michigan, the biological carrying capacity is almost always higher than your social carrying capacity or your acceptance capacity. So as you can see, there are different levels of factors that people will tolerate deer. And as a deer population sort of grows and decreases over time, there's varying changes in how that's viewed within a community. Shauna, can you see my mouse on this screen by chance?
Yes, we can see it.
Great, that'll help make things easier. So if you're just starting at time 0, your deer population is going to grow very quickly. And at this phase, everybody agrees that more deer can be accepted, and we'd love to see more deer. And then once you get up here, this group of individuals in this green area, they're pretty happy with the number of deer that are experienced in your community, where there's other individuals who would like to see a little bit more. Well, your deer population continues to grow, and now it's in here. Now you've got a group of people who are happy with the number of deer that you have. But what happened is this other group in the green now thinks there are too many deer. So you already have diverging opinions on how your deer population is viewed. Obviously, as it gets closer to biological carrying capacity, there's less food on the ground. You tend to see a herd that falls backward. And then obviously, if it ever gets to the point where it increases or goes above biological carrying capacity for whatever reason, say people are starting to feed deer and it goes above and beyond, then you typically see a rapid die-off or collapse of the population. But like deer tend to do, they bounce back very quickly. So just one of the ways to sort of illustrate the challenges that go into managing deer at a community-wide level. So I guess I want to talk about some of the management options that are available to communities. And there are pros and cons associated with each of these techniques. And I will tell you that if there was a sort of panacea solution that, sort of a one size fits all, I wouldn't be here tonight talking about this, because people would around the world, country would just be accepting those management options and sort of moving on. But you'll see some of the challenges that are associated with these managements. And one thing that a community can do is just simply do nothing. And the pros that certainly may seem to be a compromise, just sort of kicking the can down the road, and it doesn't cost anything to do nothing, certainly. But any type of leaders in the community, whether they're elected or appointed or however, there is going to be a group of individuals who are going to be very vocal and view this as inaction and potentially even irresponsible based on the level of damage or that the deer might be causing. Additionally, it's not going to solve anything. So if there is a group of individuals or an impact that's being observed from white-tailed deer because of the current population, and you continue to do nothing, you're going to see a continued degradation of that habitat and a continuation of those conflicts. So the picture I chose to accompany this topic was a forest in the mid 1980s, again in Indiana. And what you see there is what we call a browse line. And you can see that there's a very marked line where there is foliage growing above that line, and there's nothing growing below that line. And that line right here corresponds exactly with the height of a deer's mouth. So basically what's happening is that deer are eating everything that they can reach, and everything that gets above that point can flourish, but everything below that is obviously very much compromised. And so again, you're looking long-term at the health of that forest. When those older trees eventually die, if nothing is done about the deer population, you're not going to be able to successfully regenerate that forest. Another option that's typically brought up, especially by a lot of the hunters that I deal with, they want to get into these communities, they want to hunt. And there are a lot of pros associated with that. It can be inexpensive to communities to bring in hunters. Some communities have even looked at it as a very small economic stimulus, where they are either charging fees for the rights for hunters to access some of their properties, or in return for the deer that are being harvested, those hunters are required to donate a set number of deer as part of their hunting activities. and recirculate within the needy in their community. So a lot of communities have incentivized and actually provided some lean venison to some people who in their communities who actually really could use that. Hunting is largely supported by many of the public, but it's very different when you get into a community and it starts happening in potentially close proximity to your backyard. So some of the cons associated with hunting, trophy hunting of any kind, which is specifically going after large antlered males, is not appealing to very many people, especially non-hunters. They prefer it be used for food. There can be local concerns regarding hunting in the community. So certainly some communities are just not set up to allow firearms to be used in a community. It's just too close proximity to houses. And it does create certainly a safety issue. The alternative is that there are archers who are willing to take deer, and that has proven to be very safe in many communities that have gone forward with that. It just is not as the most effective or efficient way to remove deer out of a community. And depending on your lot size or your area size that you're hunting, can produce challenges in terms of retrieving that animal as well. And then there are access issues which go along with some of that. Additionally, there can be ordinances in your community that might need to be legally changed to consider allowing that. And sometimes that is very difficult to overcome if something's in place. Sharpshooting is always brought up as a consideration within a community. The problem is with sharpshooting, or I guess the pros of sharpshooting, we'll start with there first, is that the people that do this are highly trained, highly skilled. They are very safe at what they do. Additionally, they know how to do a lot of these operations, so they can be very effective and efficient at reducing deer populations and reducing it quickly. So we permit or authorize several communities each year to conduct out of season removals for deer. And in many cases, they've been very happy, and I've never had an experience where they've had safety concerns associated with some of these removals, especially with the reputable either agencies or organizations or groups that do these sort of things. The cons is that it is very expensive. You know, you cannot just simply Google deer removal experts in my community and find a list of 5 different groups that have competitive bids that you can work through. There are typically very few of these in a state, and obviously the price associated with that skill is very costly. And obviously any type of lethal removal, especially one like this, is going to be controversial and can be very polarizing with your community, especially initially. Another option that is often discussed is trap and relocate or trap and removal. Again, some of the pros of this is you're not necessarily firing a projectile, you're just trapping that animal, which can be beneficial in removing deer out of very tightly packed areas where there's a lot of people, a lot of houses. The cons, this is a very stressful activity for whitetail deer. Additionally, it's very expensive. I will say that in the state of Michigan, we do not allow for relocation of animals for several reasons. One, a lot of the previous studies indicate that that animal is very unlikely to survive any type of long-term if it's relocated to a new area. So we get all the time, we have a lot of deer in southern Michigan. Why don't we trap some of them and release them up into the Upper Peninsula where we have right now fewer deer? You know, the deer in southern Michigan, even though it's the same species, obviously of deer, you move it up into the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It's in a completely new area. There's predators up in those areas that these animals are very unfamiliar with. There's new things that they have to learn to forage and work through. They just typically don't do well in those situations. The other thing we will not allow it for is because it offers the potential to move transmissible diseases across the landscape at a much faster rate than those diseases would spread. Specifically, something like chronic wasting disease, or if you're in the northeastern part of our state, bovine tuberculosis. if you trap a deer, they might have that disease in their body. And obviously, if you move that animal to a new location, you might be introducing that transmissible disease to a lot of new deer in an area, and start a new potential source for infection. And that's certainly something that we're not willing to do. So I bring that up as an option because it's always discussed, but I want to be honest and forward with you and say that that's not allowed in Michigan. One of the things that's typically discussed is the non-lethal side of things, specifically what we call immunocontraception. And I'll go into two different types that are, I guess, on the market. The pro is that it doesn't fire a lethal projectile, which obviously is very appealing to a lot of individuals. And many of these immunocontraceptive drugs are very successful at preventing future fawns from being born. So that really addresses some of the population growth that needs to be addressed when you talk about deer management. The cons, it is very expensive. There are very few people that know how to do this or have the skills to do this. It also does not remove the deer, which might be a problem. So what I'll talk about later is trying to come up with a deer management strategy that meets the need of your community. And if that means reducing deer numbers, this might not be the best method for you, especially initially. And I will say that it is difficult, if not impossible, to achieve results in free-ranging deer herds. And this is based on some of the studies that are out there. The highest successes with immunocontraceptive drugs has been proven in places that are either island communities or have some sort of gate or fence around them, where you don't have this emigration occurring. It's not been easily replicated in a free-ranging situation. And that's largely because these drugs still need some type of booster administered every year or every couple years to continue with that, maintaining that deer as being infertile. Two types of drugs that are available for immunocontraceptives. One is called Gonacon. This has been approved by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. It is registered as something that is required to be hand injected into an animal. And it says that it does have multi-year efficacy, but requires a booster within 1 year. So another way to say that is you have to capture every deer that you're going to administer this to twice to be effective for several years. And if you've never caught a deer, and I have, it is very difficult to catch deer sometimes. Some of them can be very dumb and easy to catch. Other ones, much more challenging to do so. And a lot of research shows that to be effective long-term for immunocontraceptives, you really need to get about 80 to 90% of your female population, have their reproduction compromised. So that is a tall order. How Gonacon works, it really focuses on the reproductive cycle of mammals. So many of you, going back to biology, have probably heard of gonadotropin releasing hormone. That is produced in the hypothalamus and stimulates the release of what's called the luteinizing hormone, or the follicle stimulating hormone, in the anterior pituitary in your brain. Now, the luteinizing hormone and the follicle stimulating hormone are the hormones that drive sperm production and follicle development and ovulation. So what happens when you immunize a deer with Gonacon, it develops antibodies for gonadotropin releasing hormone. So what that means is you're not stimulating the response of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, which basically leaves that animal in a non-reproductive state. It's worth pointing out that Gonacon is registered as a pesticide. Pesticides have to be registered in a state for use by our Department of Agriculture. And as of today, Gonacon is not registered for use in Michigan. So this is not really an option for management right now. The other contraceptive agent that's out there is called Zonastat. And Zonastat is based on this idea of administering antibodies for a zona pellucida. So basically, it's a drug called PZP. PZP stands for porcine zona pellucida. Porcine is, I believe, the Latin term for pig. And then zona pellucida is the outer membrane of a developing egg where the sperm attaches. So what happens is with this drug, and I'm saying this as simply as possible just because this is how I can understand it, is that the contraceptive drug is created with basically the zona pellucida of a pig, which creates antibodies for the deer's zona pellucida. So what happens is the animal is in a reproductive state, but the sperm cannot attach to the egg, and thus it cannot be fertilized. So the animal remains reproductive. And in a whitetail deer, if they are not bred, they will come into estrus again, usually about every month, every 28 days, and go through multiple cycles until they are either bred or their body just says that's enough. So what you see is increased activity associated with this contraceptive drug because you're prolonging the breeding season. And that can be really challenging for deer, especially in a northern climate, because it's a lot of energy to chase and go through that activity. This is a hand, what they call a jab stick or remote dart delivery. So you don't have to catch every deer to administer this. But again, if you're not catching each deer and marking it, you could be administering multiple shots to the same animal and then losing some efficacy. Again, they are recommending boosters at 2 weeks and then each year with this drug. And just like Gonacon, this is not registered for Michigan because it's registered as a pesticide, and our Department of Agriculture has not gone through and registered this drug for use in Michigan. So again, not available. I spent a lot of time on these two topics because it's always of great interest to people who want to manage deer but don't necessarily want to reduce deer numbers. The other alternative from a non-lethal standpoint is sterilization. So again, you've got similar pros in that you're not firing a lethal projectile and you're preventing fawns from being born, but this is permanent. You only have to catch each deer once because you are actually doing a surgery. You're either doing what we call a tubal ligation, where you're tying essentially the fallopian tubes, or you're removing the ovaries from the animal. So either case, you're permanently altering the reproductive status of female deer. Obviously, this is very expensive to do. It might not be removing the deer in your community which are causing problems. I will say that it's difficult to achieve the results. There's a lot of time and effort going into this procedure to try to get any type of accomplishment. This we've actually done with a research group out of Connecticut. This was done in Ann Arbor. This was well publicized several years ago. Ann Arbor paid for this project because they wanted to do a novel technique in their community where they're sterilizing deer, and the ones that they can't catch and sterilize, they brought in sharpshooters to remove the rest of them. And they tried to do this sort of hybrid approach. I will say that some of that information is still being tabulated, and we're still trying to understand the results of that study. But it is important to note that shortly after that study was approved by our then director, our legislators passed a law that essentially prohibited the sterilization of any game until April 1st of 2022. At that point, we have to provide a report to the legislature and provide our recommendations for overall sterilization of wildlife in Michigan. So that I can tell you that report is not done yet, and we are having internal discussions on what that report will look like. So maybe save somebody a question there that I can't go into the full details yet of where we stand on that. But up until that point, no other community could proceed with any type of sterilization because it was prohibited by law. This is always brought up by about one person within a community, that we should reintroduce predators to sort of naturally keep the deer numbers in balance. I'm going through the pros and cons in that, maybe you can have there's an opportunity to return a historical species to its native range. Many of the predators have been extirpated and did cover much of southern Michigan. However, there are quite a few cons. We believe that this will be socially unacceptable, very expensive, obviously. There's some complicated interactions that require study. This is my long-winded way of saying that we will not be reintroducing wolves or mountain lions into your community to deal with the deer issue that you may be experiencing. That's just something that our department will not entertain, but it's always worth addressing. The last thing that is always brought up is fencing and repellents. This is less from a community standpoint and more from an individual basis. A lot of individuals move forward with some type of exclusion and trying to protect some of their most prized plants from getting browsed or eaten. It can be fairly inexpensive, although there certainly is a cost to the individual landowner to do some of these either exclusion or repellent situations. Some of the cons, that it can be very hard for maintenance. There's a lot of work that is done to sort of keep up with this. I've seen deer pull netting off. I've seen deer eat plants that had repellents placed on it. There's no guarantees with either of these treatments that something that you cherish or prize or put a lot of money into will not get damaged or completely consumed. Additionally, it does not solve a community-wide problem. So if browsing on your gardens or your horticultural plants is just part of the problem being experienced in your community, there's something else going on with your vehicle collisions, etc. Just putting fencing or repellents out is not going to solve those other problems as well. So, unfortunately, there's just not this easy solution that is available for communities to resolve their deer management challenges. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail from one of my colleagues, Dr. Emily Pomerantz, who's our human dimension specialist, and a project that she was working on during her time in New York, focused on this idea of community-based deer management and decision making. So this is more of a side that really focuses on maybe some of your community leaders, or making sure that if deer management activity is pursued in your community, that you can sort of make sure that this process, which is very much recommended, is largely being followed. And essentially the cycle sort of looks like this. First, you want to identify the problem. And the problem isn't necessarily how many deer or we have too many deer. The problem is a byproduct of what your deer are doing in your community. So for instance, are we having too many deer vehicle collisions? Are we having too much horticultural damage within our communities? Are we having native regeneration in our prized forest that's in our community? These are the things that need to be discussed based on the amount of deer in your community. And from that point, use that as sort of a jumping board to make your decisions, because it's not just about removing or reducing the number of deer. It's about resolving the problems in your community that you're experiencing that are associated with the number of deer. Then obviously you have the implementation phase. And then of course, at the end, like anything, you want to make sure that you're evaluating and adapting it. So to start off, I want to focus on, this problem definition. And that's sort of what I was talking about. You don't want to focus on how many deer you have or what's the right number of deer to have, because that changes with every community based on their tolerances, based on the problems that they're experiencing. My sort of example that I provide people is that if you have 2 deer in your community, but you feel like you need to be able to regenerate oak in your prized park, because that's something that you want your community to continue to experience for generations. You know, the amount of oak trees there that are available in that community, and those two deer are browsing oaks in your understory, the regeneration of oaks in your understory, and preventing potentially that goal from happening, where you have a lot of sustainable oaks long term, then you have too many deer in your community. Sure, it's only two, but they are preventing something from happening that you hold and cherish within your value system of your community. So the best way to get at that, honestly, is providing questionnaires to your residents in terms of what problems they're experiencing with deer, whether they feel like they have too many deer. It's sort of gauging the temperature within your community, rather than just listening to one vocal side or the other in terms of what should be done. You really want to try to understand what's happening with the general populace of your community. And then you want to start doing some tracking of some things, you know, things that are important to you, whether it's deer vehicle collisions, the number of tick-borne illnesses of members in your community, trying to understand the amount of calls that are coming in from either agricultural or horticultural damage, and maybe even doing a browsing assessment in some of these forests that might be in your community. All things that need to be considered when you first start considering going into some world of deer management. Then you go into the decision-making phase of things, and that's where you really want to start to be able to develop goals and objectives. So specifically, what are some of the outcomes and the desired future conditions you want to see in your community based on deer management? And then the objectives are things that you want to be able to measure to make sure that you're making progress towards meeting those goals. The important thing is that you want to try to match your actions to your objectives. And then a lot of communities develop a deer committee that's built with people with a lot of different personalities and views to try to come together to develop a recommendation that's best for the good of the entire community. So one example that Dr. Pomerantz, you know, my colleague, brought forward was this example in Hopewell Valley, New Jersey. You know, their deer committee in their deer management plan recommended that success of their plan should be measured by stated impact reduction goals and not based on measured deer population size. So for example, their goal is to reduce deer vehicle collisions, in this case by 25% over a certain time frame, and then by 75% from a longer time frame. They chose to focus on deer vehicle collisions as a result or an objective of their deer, or reducing deer vehicle collisions as a goal, and then how they got to that would be measured through their objectives. So again, if you're looking at reducing deer vehicle collisions and your recommendation is providing repellents or changing the ordinance to increase the height of your fences, it's probably not going to get you to the goal where you're reducing deer vehicle collisions. You have to do something that helps reduce deer vehicle collisions. And I'll point out, this might be based on the deer management side of things. It might be based on some decision, you know, maybe increasing the number of signs, creating some type of safe thoroughfare so deer can go through. It goes into some of the community planning things. So it's not just necessarily a deer management decision necessarily. Again, I say that because we hear a lot of times from communities, how many deer do we have? How many deer should we have? And then if you tell us we have too many, we can do something. And it's not that cut and dry, because you can reduce the number of deer in your community by 50%, but if you're not removing the right type of deer or the right type of deer out of your high conflict area, you might not see much, if at all, a reduction in your number of deer vehicle collisions if that's your ultimate goal. So then you get into the implementation phase, which is basically where you're conducting the action. And that's where a lot of times communities bring forward a deer plan. And there's a lot that goes into a deer plan. And I don't have as much time to go into some of this tonight, but I'm happy to do that with anybody at a later date, or certainly any community leaders that are considering moving down this direction. And then you obviously have your evaluation and adaptation side of things. So you want to make sure that the implementation side is helping to move the needle in which you want to go. And ultimately, you want to make sure that if it's not doing that, then you have a method in place to try to reevaluate or try to move forward. And again, there are several different recommendations out there in terms of things to monitor to try to help to make sure that you're moving in the direction of your goals. So again, this is the process that we feel is very good in terms of starting the discussion with deer management in a community. We talked about some of the options that were available. And then, I guess I will just throw out that the department has local biologists that can work with communities directly. At the state level, I'm always available and certainly have interest for these type of conversations and decisions. And certainly have been doing deer work for a better part of 2 decades. We also have a human dimensions specialist on hand that can help with surveys to talk about these things. So we have a lot of resources available. We're certainly happy to work with anybody in the community to try to achieve some of these goals and directives. And that includes some of the leaders in the community as well, if that's something that they want to move forward with. So with that, I wanted to thank you for everybody's time. Hopefully everybody's still with us and I didn't put anybody to sleep, but if there are any questions in the chat, I'm happy to try to address them, or I can be open to just conversation as well.
Chad, I did not put my question in the chat, and it's going to sound like a joke, but you mentioned adding more signs to the community. So the question is, do the deer pay attention to where they're supposed to cross? I realize that sounds like a joke, but really, how effective are those kinds of?
Yeah, and that's a great question. Obviously, the signs are for the benefit of the drivers, and it's usually best accompanied with some type of outreach or extension program. So I would say a lot of communities have started going through and almost tracking where their deer vehicle collision problems are, which really helps inform, one, where the signs should go. But two, they've actually gone through and maybe developed a website and communicated some of those hot spots. Like there's always that type of intersection in your community that's just sort of notorious for hitting deer. And that's just, the deer are not going to change. They're going to continue moving through there. The way to try to benefit that is to try to alter behavior through that area. So specifically, that's usually associated with either increased awareness or reduced speed, which increases your reaction time. So there is the potential to make some sort of benefits. You're not going to go from 100 to 0. It's not the cure-all. Deer will still get hit in your community, but there can be appreciable gains made by doing some of these things that aren't necessarily deer management related.
Thank you. How prevalent is the deer wasting disease in Calhoun County or Southern Michigan?
Very good question. We have not identified chronic wasting disease in Calhoun County. We've not identified it in Kalamazoo County. Really, the what I would call the epicenter of chronic wasting disease that we know of right now, and we feel we have a really good handle of where that is, at least in Southern Michigan, based on the amount of surveillance that's been conducted over the past couple of years. It's really focused on Montcalm County and northeastern Kent County, just sort of north of the Grand Rapids area. That's where we have a majority of our positive animals. It kind of sneaks into northern Ionia County right now. We do have sort of a smallish localized outbreak occurring in Jackson County. Some lower level widespread positives found in Gratiot County. We just found some cases in southern Isabella County. We found a few in Clinton and Ingham County, although we have not found those recently in either of those counties. So that gives us a little bit of hope, but nothing in your immediate area. I will say that it will get there eventually. The way chronic wasting disease kind of works, it's kind of like a very slow burn. And once it becomes established, like we believe it is in Montcalm County, it will continue to slowly radiate out from that area. and eventually pick up new counties and new locations. So it will get there eventually. But as of right now, there's really very little concern of it occurring in your area.
Related, should we be concerned about deer carrying COVID, and how about carrying ticks?
So from a COVID standpoint, this is very, very new. Obviously, we've been dealing with it as humans for a little bit longer than the deer seem to have been. But there are multiple studies out there now that have shown that SARS-CoV-2 has been fairly widespread in a lot of places that it's looked, some at higher levels, some at lower levels, but it's generally been found in a lot of deer across a broad area. And what that means, we don't know yet. It does not seem to have any impact on whitetail deer populations that we've identified right now. So that's good. Additionally, there's been no documentation of a spillover from a whitetail deer to a human. And again, that's good. I can tell you that some of the epidemiologists that have been quoted in a lot of these research articles have expressed concern that deer will maintain this as a reservoir, and that it could potentially change either within the deer, or it could sort of maintain its same sort of strain in the deer. And meanwhile, humans start getting used to other strains, and then it spills over, and then maybe that older strain that deer have sort of been perpetuating as a reservoir spill over. It could sort of start a new cycle. So nobody really knows. There's a lot of states that are working on continued surveillance and what that looks like, and I think that's probably going to be something that's a part of our surveillance moving forward, probably more from the human health side of things in collaboration with wildlife things as part of this One Health initiative where everything's sort of connected between the land, the wildlife, and humans. That's sort of a new thing that's gaining a lot of popularity because we are all very much interconnected.
What county in Michigan has the highest density of deer?
Ooh, good question. I will tell you that we don't do any type of formal density estimates, especially at a county level, largely because if you try to do that, you tend to have very wide confidence intervals around it. Really, some of our highest densities in terms of the best way to do that is really to look at some of our hunter harvest, knowing that hunters necessarily aren't distributed evenly across the landscape, but that they also tend to follow where high deer numbers are. Places like the thumb of Michigan, the very tip of the thumb, that like Huron, Sanilac, Tuscola area has a lot of deer. Additionally, some of the areas where we have some chronic wasting disease occurring are some of our higher known deer numbers. So those places like Montcalm, Mecosta, and Newaygo County, very high numbers of deer in some of those areas, which was always a concern as soon as CWD got introduced in there, because it likely increases the rate of spread amongst deer because they're interacting a lot more frequently because they're at higher densities. So that being said, Michigan as a whole tends to go from a gradient from high numbers of deer in southern Michigan to lower numbers of deer as you go further north. So there are a lot of places in southern Michigan with a lot of deer, just not quite at the numbers of some of those counties that I mentioned.
How does a city like Marshall determine its deer population?
Yeah, I guess that's a good question. I guess my first question in response to that would be, what do you hope to obtain by understanding how many deer are in your community? Because sort of like I talked about with the community-based approach, it's less about the number of deer and more about the impacts of the deer that you have. And a lot of times you can measure your progress based on the impacts that you're trying to monitor, and to see if you're doing a good enough job in managing your deer herd, or some of the actions that you're doing are showing progress or not showing progress. That being said, if you want to get an estimate for your whitetail deer population, there's several different techniques. Some of them are aerial surveys. There's new technologies with remote cameras that are able to sort of estimate deer populations in your community, either case, I would recommend working with a wildlife biologist or some type of researcher to implement a monitoring program, because I was just involved with a community in doing some of their counts for whitetail deer. And it's very difficult to, if it's done incorrectly, it limits what you can say about your confidence in terms of tracking or knowing what the number is. So doing it right, so you have an ability to, with some degree of confidence, put out an estimate is very important.
Are there fines for killing deer outside of hunting season? And related to that, do you think it would be useful to extend the hunting season?
So yes, there are fines. Deer are a game species and they require a license. And then additionally, there's rules around each seasons and in some cases which licenses can be used. There are opportunities to remove deer out of season, but it has to be permitted by our agency. So that certainly is an option. In terms of extending the season, I will be honest and say we have a very liberal deer season in Michigan right now. You can hunt deer from the beginning of October through the beginning of January. Many of those days have the opportunity to use a firearm, which is the most effective way to remove a deer. Maybe not as relevant within a community, but because our deer season is so long, continued extension of those season, you tend to get diminishing returns in terms of the number of, one, people who are interested in participating, and two, because the people who have already harvested their deer typically are done harvesting deer at that point. We have what we call sort of loosely as almost like freezer capacity, where people can only take so many deer and fill up their freezer before they're just done shooting deer. And after you start doing it for a while, it becomes very difficult to continue that process, even if you're donating deer. You just don't see as much interest in hunters in participating in deer hunting for longer than really more than a month or so. And we've got a 3-month season, so to continue that, you don't really see much improvement or effort in terms of management.
This question is wondering about the ratio of bucks to does, and really the question being, why not focus on sterilizing bucks?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you are right. We have more does than we have bucks in Michigan. Most managed deer herds are like that. We try to strive for close to a 1-to-1 ratio. Honestly, we're probably closer to a 2 to 3-to-1 ratio if I'm just giving my guess. It might seem like more than that. If you look out sort of in the landscape or a cornfield, you'll see a lot of animals with no antlers on, even in the summertime or the fall. I mean, a lot of times those animals are fawns. So your male to female ratio is a little bit closer to 1-to-1. But because you have so many antlerless animals that are out there, it looks like it's higher doe to buck ratios than it is. The reason you don't do sterilization on males compared to females is, for lack of a better term, males are, sorry guys, kind of reproductively inconsequential from a population standpoint, because deer are polygamous. So if you sterilize one male, there's going to be another male that just steps up and breeds the amount of receptive females or does that are out there. So you would literally have to get almost close to 100% of the males sterilized or preventing them from reproducing, because however many males are left, they're just going to have to work a little bit harder, but they will work harder to breed as many of those females that become receptive. And like I said, if they're not bred on their first cycle, those females will come into estrus a second time and a third time and give those males further more opportunities to breed them. So that's why you put the amount of emphasis on female deer, even though there's more of them, because you will not experience the returns on the male side of things. And it's actually an interesting study that's being done in New York and Staten Island. They're actually trying to sterilize all the males. It's a multi-million-dollar project that they're moving forward with. and I don't believe they're having success with it, even on an island population, because they're getting evidence of males swimming across, I don't know my geography, New York geography very well, but one of the rivers that separates Staten Island from the mainland.
Has there been thought to changing the guidelines around the contraceptions that are considered pesticides here in Michigan?
That's a good question. I've not been involved with any of those discussions. I really feel like that really needs some sort of champion on, if I'm being honest, to sort of move that forward. As I mentioned, the approval process really lies through the Department of Agriculture because they are registered as pesticides. So that initial, I guess, registration or authorization through the agricultural agency has to start there first. There are very few states where those immunocontraceptive drugs have been authorized for use. Gonacon probably has a few more because it's a little bit older. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not up to date on what states have approved it and which states have not, but I believe you can probably count on one hand the amount of states that have approved either of those drugs as a viable option. And then you need to get the community and the wildlife agency to sort of sign off on it. And I'm not sure of even those few states that have authorized their use where they're actively being deployed or used, because I just don't know of any communities that have gone that next step and tried to take it, or any agency that have gone forward and authorized their use on a free-ranging setting.
So this was the first question submitted soon after we started, and everyone's going to lean in because really they think you're holding back on the magic information that we need. The first question was, we've seen coyote urine tablets to put around your yard to deter deer. Do they work? And if not, what magic things do you recommend?
There, I've not seen a study on the coyote urine tablets things. I've heard various testimonials where some people will swear by them and say that it has worked and been successful. I've heard others say that they've put it out and it's not done the job. I suspect it has something to do with maybe the palatability of the plant that they are trying to protect. If it's a highly valued, highly palatable plant that is just really hard to keep deer off of, I would suspect that the success of those tablets is greatly reduced compared to one that is sort of in the more moderate palatability range, where you might have a little bit more success at keeping those animals away. I wish I had a magic, I don't want to say bullet. I guess I wish I had a magic solution for this. I can tell you that if I did, I would not be working for a state agency. I would be Chad Stewart Incorporated and selling that to a lot of communities myself. But I don't have it, and I don't know that it exists if I'm being honest with you right now, at least not today.
I also see a question related to management. Do some municipalities that you know of in Michigan allow 8 feet fences?
Yes, I'm certain that there are communities that have changed their ordinances to 8 feet, and maybe it's just in the backyard, maybe not the front yard. I've seen communities completely resistant to those ordinances because they're afraid that, I guess, how have I heard it phrased? That it will turn their community looking almost like cell blocks. Like everybody will put these large, very high private 8-foot fences around their yards, and it will lose some of the feel that neighborhoods have. So I've seen community leaders reject that idea as well. I do believe some communities have that in place, and that can be very helpful, especially if it's more of a private fence, because the deer are very reluctant to jump over something that they don't know is on the other side. The other thing I would caution people about is putting those sort of wrought iron fences up that have the wrought iron that extends above the highest most crossbar. I've seen deer end very badly trying to clear one of those and misjudge it. It is not a pretty sight. So that's a type of fence you definitely want to avoid.
Okay, last question from the chat, and then if anyone wants to unmute, we'll open for that. For communities that have implemented successful programs in removing deer or reducing their impact, is there any data on the long-lasting effects?
Most communities that enter into deer management are continuing into deer management. It's not something where you're going to go in and say, we are going to reduce the population and plant our mission accomplished flag and sort of be done with deer, and we solve that problem, let's move on, because deer will return. So most of the states are, most of the communities are continuing to be engaged. Typically, how it operates is a state goes into, and they typically use some sort of a lethal removal option, whether it's sharpshooters, hunters, or some combination of both. In the first year or 2 years, it could be fairly substantial. Maybe the first year is very light, just to sort of introduce it into the community, just to show that it's going to be successful and safe, and nobody or their pets will get hurt. And then they kind of ramp up, and then they start to see results, and then they're able to ramp it down quite a bit and get into what we call almost like a maintenance phase. And that can be every year activity at a much reduced rate, or reducing the span between the activity occurring. So maybe they do a year on and a year off and a year on again. And some communities have had success with that model. Other communities sort of start lower and then continue to ramp up, because like the one community we know here, sort of close to locally here, they started off with archery hunting because it was, first of all, accepted, and it was cheap. It didn't cost the community anything, and they had some very good success for quite some time, and started to see a dip in their trends that they were monitoring. But then it wasn't turning out to be enough, so their trends started going the opposite way. So they've maintained their archery program, but then they've added on a lethal removal with actually their police force afterwards. And I believe they've just started that, so I can't talk about the trends that they've been seeing, because they've just started to make that switch. But I think they're a little bit more optimistic that will get the trends moving again back in the same direction. So they sort of built up to it based on the political will within their community, and obviously the budget that's allocated for that expense as well.
If anyone would like to unmute to ask a question, now would be a great time. I'll just watch to see if your microphone goes off or if you wave frantically. And in lieu of any raised hands, I just recommend this in lieu of applause. And then I'll hand it to Carla to wrap us up and move us into the Garden Club meeting.
Thank you so much, Officer Stewart. My goodness, you've left us with such a multitude of information to think about and mull over and share. I also want to thank you, Shauna, for just so beautifully chairing this meeting and orchestrating the chat and everything. Thank you, and Marshall District Library, for being our partners in crime here. With that, I turn it over to Alice.